One. Great. So it's at 1:01. I'm going to call the meeting to order. And Sally, did you want to do a roll call?
Yes, if I could, please.
Okay.
Paul Kehoe. Andrew Tennant. Jeff Atkinson.
Present.
John Inglis. Roxanne Darling.
Present.
Kirby Thompson. Bill King.
Present.
Cindy Kelsey.
Present.
Faye Campbell.
Present.
Krista Lowry. She said she'll be late. Bev Holmes.
Present.
Chuck Reekhoff.
Present.
Phil Sweetnam.
Present.
John Carreau.
Present.
Eli Alshantiri.
Present.
Janet Mason.
Here.
And Glenn Gower.
Here.
Great.
Thanks, Sally. And I didn't do this formally at our last meeting, but Chuck Riegloff is our new representative from the Township of Greater Madawaska. So welcome to the board, Chuck.
Thank you very kindly.
And before we get into the formal business, this being the first month where we have a new national holiday recognizing the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I wanted to start today's board meeting off with a land acknowledgement. So if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to move forward with that. September 30th marks our country's first National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day to remember, to learn, and to work for change. As the descendant of people who settled and prospered in the lands of many First Nations, I, like so many others, was raised without knowing the history of the land and the people who had cared for it since the beginning. My own path toward learning that history and the truth of my people's relationship with that land and the people we displaced remains long, but I commit to making that journey, and I know that I will not be alone. In that spirit, I want to respectfully acknowledge that the board of the Mississippi Valley Conservation Authority meets on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people and is charged by the Crown with the conservation of the watersheds of the Mississippi and Carp rivers, both of which flow through that land, as well as the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat and the Mississauga-Nishnabeg. We offer our gratitude to the First Peoples for their care for and teachings about our earth and our relations. As we move together along the path of reconciliation, may we relearn and once again honor those teachings and bring them into the work that we do here. As we meet today, and I reflect on the meaning behind our new National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, I observe that voices are missing from our table, that lands of cultural significance are not included among the lands we are charged to protect and conserve by the Crown, that vital and traditional species have and continue to be put at risk by the work that we do, and that the waterways named to recognize the first people who lived on them at the time of settlement still do not bear their true names. We have much work to do. Thank you, and miigwech. I forgot to do the declarations of interest. At this point, if anybody has a conflict of interest, you can declare it now or when we get to those items on the agenda. No, you've received a copy of the agenda for today's meeting in front of you, which I'll note includes a consent agenda. If I could have a motion to accept the agenda for the September 15th, 2021 Board of Directors meeting and that it be adopted as presented. Moved by Faye Campbell, seconded by Bill King. All in favor? Carried. Next, our procedure for this is still a bit muddy, but we're going to go through it as I'm going to go through it as instructed. It's a bit duplicitous, but we'll do it. Could I have a motion that that the consent agenda for the September 15th, 2021 Board of Directors meeting be adopted as presented?
Maybe we should ask if anyone have to pull any of those items or everybody agree with, because sometimes some member may have consent on 3 items, but might not consent on 1 item. But if everybody consent on all those items, yeah, that's when we have a motion to. So.
Yeah, I agree. That's the clearer procedure. So is there any items on the consent agenda that people wish to have lifted out and added to the main agenda?
So I move we accept the consent agenda as presented.
Do I have a seconder for that motion? I'll go with Bev Holmes. All in favor of adopting the consent agenda as presented and the items therein? Carried. Sally, that'll cover off both of those motions in the package. Finally, just going through the admin, could I have a motion that the minutes of the Mississippi Valley Board of Directors meeting held on July the 21st be received and approved as printed? I have a mover for the minutes, John Carew, seconded by Faye Campbell. All in favor? Just raise your hands. It's carried. And you've also received the minutes from the special board meeting that we held last week. It was emailed to you after the fact. If I could have a motion that those minutes be received and adopted as printed. Moved by Chuck, seconded by Glenn. All in favor of adopting those minutes from a meeting last week? Motion is carried. Now we can get down to the work of the meeting that the administration is all done. We have Jennifer is going to give us a watershed condition report. The floor is yours, Jennifer.
Perfect. Can everyone see my screen and hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yep.
Perfect. All right. So the month of August did end up being very hot and dry. As you can see, it was the second hottest August on record for Ottawa. But with the extremely wet July, we had flows throughout the watershed have stayed above any kind of drought conditions. And by the end of the month, we were sitting at normal flows for this time of year. The upper lakes have remained stable over the last month, again, due to the amount of rain we received in July. Right now, the majority of the lakes are sitting at their historical average. Flows in the main river have improved over the last month and are now averaging 10 CMS. This is due to the drawdown at Crotch Lake. We do expect it to stay within this range for the rest of the month and into October. Crotch Lake level is still sitting above average for this time of year, giving us more water to augment downstream. So it's been very helpful that the rain in July, we were able to get above normal for that lake, and we were able to help augment downstream flows. And for this reason, levels on Dalhousie Lake and Mississippi Lake are sitting at normal levels right now, and after spending the majority of the time this summer below average. So that's helped the lower end of the watershed a lot. The drawdown on Chabamika Lake began last week due to accommodate the reconstruction of the dam. Logs may need to be removed at Mazenah to stabilize lake levels from the increased flows, but as of right now, the lake is still stable, so we haven't had to remove any logs there. All the other dams will follow their normal drawdown schedule, with Pine Lake and Carlton Place beginning sometime this week, early next week. We'll be starting those drawdowns, and Kashawakmak, Mississauga, and Big Gull Lakes will begin after Thanksgiving weekend. The long range forecasts are calling for fairly normal fall. And with the temperatures cooling off and rain in the forecast and preparations underway for the fall drawdowns on the upper lakes, stream flows are expected to remain at seasonal conditions for the rest of the fall, or for the rest of the month and into the fall. So everything looks normal, everything looks good. There's no really any big issues to talk about, and that is everything. Any questions?
The first question, Jennifer, is we didn't see the slide. We only saw the first slide and we didn't see the rest of it.
Oh,
I think your screen is froze on you, so, but I don't have a question. I just want you to know. So maybe you can send it to us separately after, or unless we have.
sure. I can do that. Sorry about that. It's showing up on my phone. I don't know why it's not showing up there.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Are you able to stop sharing your screen, Jennifer?
Yes.
There we go. Are there any other questions for Jennifer? No, see none. Thank you, Jennifer. And folks, there's your first sign that summer is over. That, with the notice of drawdowns of the lakes, that's how we know. Okay, the next item on the agenda is a proposed fee for ministerials for MZO permit applications. This is a report coming from Matt Craig. I'll have Matt introduce his report first, and then we'll get on to the motion. Matt, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. I'll just give a brief background. Traditionally, we update our fee schedule for budget purposes in the fall, speaking of the fall. And we have a new fee that we're proposing, and I'll just give a bit of background about the history and amendments to the CA Act. So as part of Bill 197, it provides provisions for the minister to override provincial policy in regard to land use decisions in the Planning Act. And therefore we have these MZO issues. And also there's been recent changes to the CEA Act and amendments, which relates to any project involving an MZO. We haven't had an MZO between the three Eastern Ontario CAs to date. There has been some in Eastern Ontario related to agriculture, as I understand, more to the north of us. We've been watching the TRCA, the Toronto Region Conservation Authority, and Lake Simcoe, who have been heavily involved in issuing permits and projects related to MZOs, and certainly they're quite intensive. And I think the thing to remember about these applications is it's not a traditional permit. We're not looking at whether it meets the 4 tests, and if it meets policy, we're looking at mitigation, which is a little bit different than our usual way of business. They'll be extremely technically challenging from what we've learned from other MZOs and other CAs. There'll be a lot of coordination and review. There has been standards and guidelines developed by these authorities, by the other authorities that have experienced MZOs, and they're basically addressing the ecological mitigation. But we still have some work to do here in Eastern Ontario to look at these guidelines and to be prepared for one. So we're proposing a fee which is double the largest major project fee. So this is in preparation of the board to receive this, knowing some of the background. We've coordinated these fees with the other Eastern Ontario CAs, with the South Nation and the Rideau Valley. And again, just given what we know, how challenging they are technically and the associated technical reports, that this is if we do receive one, it will be a major undertaking. So that's why we're proposing a fee of double the major project fee as it currently is outlined in the fee schedule. So the purpose was to provide a little bit of background and to give the board a heads up that this will be part of the proposed fee schedule.
Thanks, Matt. Eli, I see your hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And my question to the chair, how did not just us, but how did all the conservation landed at double the fee? Isn't the fee always been to cover the cost when it comes to permit?
Is that to me? Sorry, Eli?
Yeah, to you, yes,
Yep.
to you. Like, I mean, well, how did you land it at double? I mean, I thought all along the fee, it could be double, could be less than double. It's supposed to cover your cost. That's my understanding of a fee.
Okay, so how we came up with that fee is, again, when there's an MZO, it is not a small project, it's not a rezoning. We looked at what other authorities are charging, and they have basically followed the same format, that looking at their largest fee and then doubling the fee is indicative of the type of complexity of the application we anticipate we'll receive and the technical review. And the coordination in the review, because it's not a traditional review against the policies, it's more labor intensive. The TRCA had 8 people working on an MZO. We do have a provision in there also that we charge per the technical review of any associated technical submissions as well, like so stormwater or an ecological report.
And how many of those proposals you expect to receive perhaps a year?
I have no idea. They've been receiving them for the past year in other areas, and we have not received one. That's really hard for me to anticipate, but we need to be prepared in regard to cost recovery and understanding the complexity of them.
Okay, well, obviously I don't have an opinion how much we need to charge without have done any of them before, but is the board open to revisit this once at least we have an application and we dealt with it and we see it might cost us a lot more than double, or maybe cost us a lot less than double the fee? So are we open to revisit this item once we had the experience with an application?
I would think that the board is free to do as it wills on determining the policy of the Conservation Authority, Eli. I think that would be a given.
Should we give staff direction to bring us back a report after they deal with the first application, just to see where we are? Because this is a new territory, as we all understand. We haven't done it before. Sally, I'm looking at you.
I see Sally's hand up too.
Oh, okay.
All right. Well, the first thing I wanted to point out is that this report and the motion is simply looking for approval in principle that we do introduce a fee. Though Matt's spoken to notionally it being double our highest rate, I myself wanted us to sit down and look at that in more detail between now and when we table the updated fee schedule, probably at our next meeting. So between now and then, we'll be able to come back to the board with more detail. The purpose of this report was more to explain why we want to introduce this unique new fee to our fee schedule. So when we table that report at the next meeting, I can actually embed right into the report that after we've had experience with MZOs, that we report back to the board. Was it, an appropriate level? Do we want to adjust, reassess the fee? So I can incorporate that into next month's report.
Thank you.
Good. I see your thumbs up, Eli. I'll take that as a note of satisfaction. John Corrow's next. John. You're on mute, John.
Sorry, Chair. Matt, when you talked about the scope of work, you focused on mitigation measures. Is there any room for adaptation measures as well? And I raise that because, quite honestly, when we look at climate change adaptation, that is very forefront in our watershed plan. And I think it would be worthy of some additional consideration if it hasn't been included. And on the point previously raised by Eli and addressed by Sally as well, I think we've had a good history of trying to look at full cost recovery wherever possible. So I would not limit it just to fees. So a question and a thank you.
Thank you, John. I've looked at the documents prepared by other CAs, and it's heavily into compensation. And to be honest with you, adaptation could be the process, as I understand, is that the authority provides conditions on approval of a permit, because basically we're ordered to issue a permit, and the applicant has the right to appeal those conditions. So if staff provide a guidance document in regard to offsetting compensation, which includes an adaptation, or there's feedback to include it, and it's approved by the board, then it can be part of conditions moving forward. So it's not eliminated, it's just we aren't there yet.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, John and Matt. Phil, you're next up.
Yes, I'm sort of along the same line of concern. You're obliged to give a permit. You can't ask for additional engineering studies or anything like that. Do you get what was given to the minister? How much sort of assurance do you have there won't be sort of after effects? And if there is an after effect, does that become our responsibility? And so some of that fee might be related to just insurance for future challenges we might experience. Thank you.
Go ahead, Matt.
No, they clearly need to provide justification and rationalization through technical studies. So those fees do not include the review of those studies. We have engineering staff and staff reviewing biology and EIS studies. So those are additional. They clearly have to meet, if it's any risk to the function of a wetland, or it causes risk in regard to flooding, you still have to address those issues, and we need to provide conditions that, our number one mandate is people, lives, and property. So we can't forget about our mandate. So they don't have the ability to overwrite those principles. So in regard to the fee, when you look at the amount of consultation, pre-consultation meetings, if we want cost recovery for applications, it doesn't take a long time to add up a significant amount of time and fees associated with one of these large projects.
If I could just add, I'm sure Euro will agree, good engineers are hard to come by and expensive. So you want good engineering reports to make sure that you minimize the after development effects. Thank you.
Thank you, Phil. Are there any other questions or comment for Matt before we move on to the main motion? Okay, we'll move on. Could I have somebody move that the board directs staff to add a new fee during the next update of the MVCA fee schedule for the processing of applications under section 28.0.1 of the Conservation Authorities Act to recover the higher costs associated with projects approved by ministerial zoning order? Moved by Krista Lowry, seconded by Eli El-Shanturi. All in favor? Opposed? Motion is carried. Our next few items on the agenda are information items. I should have renamed this meeting the Matt Craig Show. So I'll hand the floor over to Matt for the next number of items, and following his presentation on each one, I'll open the floor up for questions and comments. So Matt, your timeline performance report for Section 28 applications is on the floor.
Okay, thank you again. I'll be brief. Just some background. Conservation Ontario issued a reporting document, and high growth CAs have been required for over a year to report on their timelines. And this, for board members who've been on the board for a while, they may remember the calc reporting, where we had to provide basically a monthly report on how quickly we were having a turnaround on our permits and issuing permits. So this is kind of rebooting that process, but the timelines are shorter. And although it's not required for all CAs, it certainly is recommended. So we implemented this type of reporting in March, and the timelines are very prescriptive, as you can see. And I think the feeling is that staff and the authority has been, we've been able to accommodate the issuing permits within acceptable timelines throughout most of our operations and most of our permits. So we've had to update our record keeping software to basically provide this reporting, which was a bit of a challenge, because this was all new, and it took programming and more diligence for staff and administration to keep track of this type of information. As you can see in the results, we look favorable in regard to turning these timelines around. They're somewhat deceiving, because a permit can take 6 months, but it can also stop and start, and the CO guidelines discuss this. So if you have a permit that comes in and we review it in 2 weeks, but they're missing information, it stops. And then when they provide the correct information, it reboots. So for those permits where people are constantly missing information and filter it in slowly, and it may take 6 months, permits can take years, to be honest with you. They will meet the timeline in regard to the CO reporting. So there's some files are problematic, but overall, given the stopping and starting and the freezing of permits, we turn out favorable. So we plan to do this biannually, and if there's a trend where we're not meeting timelines, we'll have to address it. But it's really an information for Conservation Ontario. They'll take this data, and for the board to understand how we're doing in regard to prescriptive timelines that have been outlined by Conservation Ontario.
Thank you, Matt. I see John Crow has his hand up. Go ahead, John.
Thank you, Chair. So a question for both you, Matt, and you, Sally. Do you anticipate that there might be any public interest in that kind of performance? I mean, certainly if in fact we are doing it well, maybe not releasing the reports, but one should never waste good news.
It's part of the agenda practice. Again, when we are, I think most people that are other professionals in the industry understand the timelines, and if we aren't responding quick enough, we certainly get reminded. I think people can appreciate that people, we do get reminded, and if there was a trend that there was a problem, then we would need to address it. But I don't think there is a huge problem. Some files, just the nature of that file will take longer than normal. And it's, to be honest with you, it's a lot of the quality of the submission. If you look at if you look at all the rebuilds, which I'm going to talk about in Constance Bay, there's one contractor there that uses a firm, and they know our policies, they know the rules and the tests, and basically their submissions are bulletproof. But when you get people that are working outside the area that aren't familiar with them, then there's delays and there's problems, and it's an education experience. So I think the municipalities and the local firms and consultants understand the timelines and understand that we do our best, but that doesn't always work out. So I'd be hesitant to send these out because it might to say this is great news at this point until we have a better understanding and provide a couple of reports, just because we need to iron out any bugs in the software. And just I'm a little hesitant, to be honest with you.
Do you have a follow-up, John?
I do. My emphasis really is on sharing the news, not the reports. So where you've got good bragging rights, I'm just encouraging you, perhaps best of all, Sally, that's a useful reminder for our partners, including municipalities and those that we work with, that our track record is good. It's something that we monitor, and we're not just relying on their review. We do our own internal review as well. So that's where I would put the emphasis. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Sally, did you have a response to that? I see your hand up.
Yeah. So I just wanted to say that after all of our board meetings, we do a summary report that gets issued to all the municipal councils. And in that, we will be including this as, a highlight from this meeting. And we send that out in advance of, the whole minute taking process, and to, ensure that councils have the opportunity to get a sense of the work we're doing. So my intent is absolutely to publish this result. But I would also say that I share Matt's sentiments. There's a lot of story in behind those numbers, and it's early days for the Conservation Ontario's whole process around this. But I was very pleased myself to see the numbers, particularly given the constraints that we've all been operating under, in this reporting period. So kudos to Matt and his gang for being able to achieve these, because quite frankly, I hadn't thought that we would do as well as we did, and it's only due to the diligence of his staff that we have. So well done, Matt and gang.
Thank you, Sally. Krista is next, and then Faye, you're after Krista.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. And just a question for you, Matt. And I think the report's great. I think the results in the report are excellent. And I'll ask my question, and if you want to take it, as a sidebar, that's just fine. We can take it offline. But I was curious when you had said, just in describing the report, how some of the applications kind of start and stop and whatnot, and how that can extend how long a file would be looked at. And I guess my question is an operation question. Like, are staff looking at files before an application is deemed complete, or is it that it's complete, but the information that you've received isn't adequate? There's further information that's needed, or are staff starting on something before all the information has been submitted?
Oh, it's a good question. Pre-consultation, I can't emphasize enough how we want pre-consultation. It's the best. If we could provide any word to anybody who's going to make an application, is pre-consult, and I'm sure the municipalities are the same. So a lot of the routine applications, that pre-consultation doesn't take as much time, and when we do get it, it's I would say 70% of the time it's bulletproof. We're ready to process it, and we can move forward on those. So other ones, the more complex a project goes, the more stops and starts there'll be, because you have so many different components, whether you need like a groundwater study or a stormwater study, or you have a wetland or flood proofing. So the more complicated it is, the more the more stops and starts you have. And I also would say is, given the past year and a half, there's the lack of consultants and contractors. So people want to start, they have a decent plan, but they're missing something, and it's no fault of their own. There's just not the professionals available to fill those gaps. So it's been a trying year, I think, for people, but I think most people understand pre-consultation is the most important thing. As long as we keep emphasizing that, and our municipalities are really good about notifying us about applications. So I would just keep emphasizing that if anybody could say anything, and the fact that the more complex it is, the more stops and starts.
Okay, fair enough. Thanks a lot, Matt. Thanks, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Faye, go ahead.
Okay. When I guess what are you reviewing? The hydrology study, the engineer's report, or what? When you say you're reviewing, what would you be reviewing?
Okay, so in regard to this, we have agreements, right, with the city and Lanark County and other municipalities in regard to different technical studies. So we always review the stormwater study, okay, because of the receiving water body, if there's an impact from quantity or quality. So if there's more flows, or if it's going to affect, the health of the receiving water body. So we always look at stormwater. We look at EISs, so environmental impact studies. We can look at what's called an HIS, and hydrologic impact study, if it affects the feature in regard to the adjacent lands, the wetland. And we also have an agreement with the city and Lanark County. We don't review hydro-G studies in Beckwith because of some of the complications in groundwater there. So if it's not on services, so it's not on municipal services, we look at impacts to, in regard to the septic impacts and in regards to the wells. So it can get quite complicated when you integrate all three of those things, the EIS, the stormwater, and the hydro-G. And that's one of the problems, is that they're not integrated studies, and they need to be.
What do you mean by integrated? Done by the same person, same company, or?
They don't have to be done by the same company, but they all need to be aware of the implication or constraints each one of those studies recommendations makes. So if you have constraints in regard to stormwater or the wetland, they all need to understand what the other studies are recommending. And it's getting better, but that's been a problem.
Do you have a form like that they should complete? Like, do you have a guideline that you give to the builder or the contractor to know what studies, what you are requiring to be, or does that just come naturally from?
There are checklists. They're somewhat dated. We're revising them with in partnership with the County of Lanark. But there's basically, for stormwater, there's a manual published by the province, which they need, which has very clear objectives. And we do have internal checklists, and we're actually publicizing external checklists very shortly to give some guidance to contractors and consultants. So we do have checklists. They're somewhat dated. They need to be updated. And there are certain provincial standards that, we have very little influence on the criteria.
Okay, thank you. That's very interesting.
Thank you, Faye. Go ahead, Sally.
If I could just add to what Matt was saying, I think the important thing to realize there is that particularly when we are doing these reviews on behalf of or under these MOUs, either with the city or the county, that it's their checklists, right? So we've been working with the County of Lanark to update their checklist. And though our name is on it, it's the checklist is to implement county policy. So we definitely have our own documents and all sorts of things on our website regarding our permits in particular. But as it relates to what's required in association with the review of planning applications under MOUs, that's subject to the policy criteria checklist of those jurisdictions, the County of Lanark and the City of Ottawa.
Thank you, Sally. Faye, you've still got your hand up. Is you trying to put it down? Okay. So I don't see any other questions for Matt. Thank you, Matt. We'll move on to item number 5 on the agenda, which is the Ontario Regulation 153/06 Permit Activity Report. The big thick part of the agenda.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We issued 138 permits during this reporting period. We're on track to have another busy year. We're up to, I believe, almost 220 as of today. And the details are listed in the thick part of the agenda, as you mentioned.
Thank you. What's the main driver behind all of those permits? Is it the new construction happening across the region, or are people still rebuilding from 2019?
It's a combination. I think there is a lot of people investing in their own property and infrastructure. We're still getting the rebuilds. It's basically everything. There's still some shorelines. I would say people are kind of looking at, I don't want to call them marginal lands, but adjacent to wetlands. That's why you have the big number behind the wetlands, is that people are building the adjacent lands, and we can mitigate generally those types of applications. So it's just a combination. I haven't looked at the trends, and I think that's what we do at the end of the year, but it's just busy.
Obviously. Yeah. Thank you, Matt. Any questions for Matt? I'm going to go to Eli, and then I'll go to Sally.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and thank you, Matt. It's not just for the report, but also for you making yourself available when we ask people to do the pre-consultation with you. And if something we heard earlier from John, some good news story we need to publicize, I will focus on that. The pre-consultation with our staff. It saves you time and money. And I think that's 2 items people would love to hear about in a time like this. Because the challenge is no different whether the conservation or the city or any other municipality. We have the big company with consultant, planner, lawyers, you name it, as a large developer. And then the individual get upset. How come those people get approved before my application, and his application or her application is quite a bit short? So we always emphasize on a pre-consultation, and I think the city does a great job asking people to pre-consult with all departments. The first meeting is for free, and then after that they put a deposit. But I just want to know, Matt has been doing this, especially to the victim of the floods in the last few years, and it resulted in a good way, because those people now, they feel comfortable, come and talk to us instead of building the wall at night when there's nobody looking, and then we have to go back and deal with it. So it's just like, if anything we need to emphasize on is that the pre-consultation with our staff, and make that happen more than anything. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Eli. Sally, go ahead.
I just wanted to pick up on one of the things that Matt said, and that was with respect to the number of permits related to wetlands. One of the things that he and I have been discussing is the upward trend in those. And that speaks to the overall trend that we've spoken to previously, that all the good land that's been easily developable has been secured, and more than likely already developed or plans on it. So we're seeing more and more of these, I'll call it marginal land type applications coming in. And that's reflected in this number. Matt, I forget what you told me historically. I think maybe it was 80 years or something. It was a much lower number that we used to see historically. And the thing to bear in mind with these is, because they're marginal lands, they're that much more complex for us to review and understand. And so they do tend to take more time to review. So I just wanted to share a bit of that background behind that number there.
Any other questions or comments for Matt regarding his report. Otherwise, we'll move on to item number 6, which is a draining and grading presentation.
Just going to share my screen, Mr. Chair. It's going forward for some reason. Can you see that?
Yes, we can.
Okay. First, one thing is I issue like 2% of the permits. It's staff that are reviewing the permits. They're the ones that make themselves available and for pre-consultation and make sure that we meet those timelines. I do a lot of signing, so just so people know that. This is a presentation that that was on the agenda for a while. So it's a bit late in some of the issues that I wanted to discuss, but there's been some pretty urgent matters for the board to deal with. So it's essentially dealing with the rebuilds and the impacts of the floods, and some of the challenges that staff have, and maybe some of the questions that some of our municipal staff are receiving. So from 2017, remember we had the flood mainly just on the Ottawa River in 2017. Prior to 2017, we received 10 applications for rebuilds, and you know there was no sense of urgency for those rebuilds of people that were looking at you know, upgrading their home, or the home that had come to the end of its life. So the urgency and the volume that we've experienced in 2017 is like nothing we've ever received. And some of the challenges is that there's different municipal requirements within the watershed, the timelines associated with the Planning Act, if they needed a minor variance or a site plan, or people have no place to live. There was financing issues and getting funds and compensation from the government. We dealt with a lot of insurance agents. And then I mentioned contractor availability and the costs escalating. So these people that have had to go through this have had some real challenges. We're certainly aware of them. Anyways, it's something to realize. And people don't understand our requirements in regard to when we review a rebuild, what do we need? So I'm going to go into more detail, but grading plans, safe access, floodproofing, drainage, septic. And to review these applications is you don't go to school to learn this. You need it to do it through practical experience, and you need, there has to be some mentoring and training and basically hands-on experience. So we've had some staff turnover, and they've really adapted well in turning these applications around. This is just kind of a visual of where the rebuilds are. So we had some on Dalhousie Lake and Mississippi Lake, up obviously around Constance Bay, and up towards Fitzroy. So it's been pretty spread out. This is where we have the regulation mapping, and this is where our floodproofing is required. One of the biggest questions we get, people just want to fill their lots and not have to be bothered with, they think they will never have to be bothered with flood issues. So there's a bunch of reasons on why you can't just go ahead and fill. First of all, most of these areas, Mississippi Lake and Ottawa River, they've gone through flood reduction studies, and there's been certain conditions and recommendations that have come out of those studies, or engineering studies, about floodproofing. They've also made recommendations into dividing the floodway, the floodplain into two different areas, one of a higher risk in the floodway and one of a lesser risk in the flood fringe. So it also addresses capacity. So you can't just fill everywhere, because it takes storage away from other areas. And also you can't fill because then you're changing the designation on your property, and therefore the rules change. So you're still at risk, but you could be surrounded by water. You could have wave uprush issues. And therefore, and you don't have restrictions on the size of the building or replacement issues. So those are kind of the administrative and technical reasons. And then you also have cumulative impacts. If we allow everybody to fill, there's going to be impacts on infrastructure and drainage in regard to roads and culverts. There's drainage with neighboring properties where you potentially could aggravate a situation beside you. And we do have a lot of small lots in Constance Bay and Mississippi Lake. And shoreline walls, people think I'll just build a wall and then I won't flood. Well, in Constance Bay, where it's all sand, the water just percolates through, and it actually will impact the integrity of these walls if they're not designed properly. So flood-proofing through shoreline walls is not a realistic option. So when we talk to landowners, we have to kind of go through this information, and generally they understand, and there's provisions which I'll get to. So this is a diagram that I find very helpful that we give to landowners, and it provides the requirements in regard to flood proofing, the amount of fill they can put in, and it also talks about the impacts to when I talk about flood proofing, I talk about the elevation of their home and the living space and the crawl space. So it outlines the different areas, and it kind of talks about grades 3 to 1. So this is where they start. They get a general idea of, okay, this is what I can do, and my house has to go this high. Grading plans is basically the requirement of the CA and municipalities. Some municipalities, they're required, including the City of Ottawa. And the grading plan has all the things that we look at, and this is what we interpret. And as Mayor Lowry discussed, this is where we go back and forth. And if you have a good submission, then it can move forward. But if you don't, then this is where you get the stops and starts. And pre-consultation is so important. So if someone approaches us that they're going to rebuild their house, we tell them that these are the things you need to do. These are the restrictions in regard and the constraints in regard to our policies, and we give them a sample. So in the end, grading plans have to be done by a qualified professional, generally a surveyor or a professional engineer. They have to show the floodproofing requirements and show the elevations. You have to show how you're driving into your property from the road, and that you create safe access so that if there is a flood, you have no more than a foot of water on your property, on your laneway, I'm sorry. The extent of fill, so all the way around the dash line around the building is the extent of fill, and your septic also has those constraints. And then you can't push water onto your neighbor, so you can't, you have to have drainage provisions and swales on your property. And you have to have separation distance from your house and your septic. So staff have to look at, the planning issues in regard to setbacks. They have to be aware of the Ontario Building Code in regard to septic and fill around the foundation. So it's a fairly complicated process. And one of the questions that came up from one of our members is what kind of compliance do we do on after we issue a permit? So the most important thing is that people are investing hundreds of thousands of dollars into this infrastructure. So the most important thing for us is we go out and we do an inspection and an elevation of the footing before they finish pouring the foundation, so that we know the building is flood-proofed. So that's part of the condition of the permit. So Andy or the compliance technician will go out and shoot those elevations. So that's our most important thing, that you're investing all this monetary investment into this property, make sure it's flood-proofed and it doesn't get damaged. So when people are finished with their building, they submit a as-built, what's called, which is the grading plan that shows all the final grades. There's the before and after, and then we compare that. We do a final comparison with the permit, and not a full topographic survey doesn't always end up on our desk. Just simply time constraints, they can't get the contractor, and they do put a deposit down to secure. Basically, that's a security deposit for us to make sure there is a topographic survey. And we do get a lot of complaints in regard to excess fill. So they haven't graded their property in the way that they've submitted in their plan. And we do get a lot of calls, unfortunately, about this. And it's kind of it's not something that we're proactive. We just, given the amount of permits, it's really difficult for us to do a follow-up survey and inspection. So it's kind of complaint driven. And that's just going to show an example. This is a house on Mississippi Lake, and when there was a complaint, we got to the property. It turned out that none of the drainage swales were completed. The garage was actually not built in the correct location, and there was excess fill. So just resolving this property alone took days of effort. So this is something you don't count on. It's something that, how do you get cost recovery on things of this nature? So it's somewhat complex. And this is the property itself, where you start off with a small cottage bungalow, and then you bring in fill, and you're building a permanent home. The photo on the bottom is the result of us making them comply in regard to the construction of drainage swales so that don't impact the neighbor. So those are just some of the issues that we've dealt with over the last 4 years. We did deal with it prior to that, but just not to the volume that we're dealing with now. And this is an example where someone chose, if you look at the grading plan, they chose to extend the fill out to the property line, and then you've got the neighbor, any drainage is being pushed onto their property. You can see their house isn't flood proof. So we actually made them remove it and install drainage. So they probably had to move it back to somewhere approximately around where the shadow of the house is, and then build a drainage swale. So these are the kind of issues Andy and the compliance technician deal with more often than not. So that's just a quick summary of some of the trials and tribulations of the past 4 years of flooding, and it's still going on. I think the process is more straightforward for people now, but nevertheless, it's still a bit of a challenge.
Thanks for that presentation, Matt. Does anyone have any questions for Matt? I can't see everyone. Matt's still sharing his screen.
I can stop.
Yeah, please. Any questions or comments now that you've been educated? Very good.
Could I ask if you mentioned professional engineers and surveyors? I assume you do allow the what do you call them, the technical, the people who are just below the engineers, and they've got a community college. The name escapes me at the moment. Yeah, you'd accept their grading plans, would you?
My understanding, the qualified professional, my understanding, the way it works, Phil, is that often they do the work and then the engineer will check it.
Thank you.
Anyone else? Oh, thanks again for that presentation, Matt. That brings an end to the Matt Craig Show portion of today's meeting. We have one item left on the agenda, and that's adjournment, but I'll caution you, we do have a Source Protection Authority meeting immediately following, so don't run off after the meeting is adjourned, please. We've got some business to take care of there. Could I have a motion to adjourn the meeting, please, the board meeting? Moved by Bill King, seconded by Roxanne. All in favor? Motion is carried. Thank you, everyone. If folks need a few minute break before we move into the next portion of the meeting, or are we fine to just carry forward? There is one item on that agenda. I don't see cameras going off. I'm going to proceed. I just need a minute to shuffle my paperwork here. So at 2:02 p.m., I'll call the meeting of the Source Protection Authority to order. Sally, could you do a roll call, please? Or is this required?
I can observe at this point.
Okay, we can do that. We do still have a quorum that I can see. The first motion that I have is adoption of the agenda as presented. Could I have a mover to adopt the agenda for the Source Protection Authority meeting? Moved by Roxanne, seconded by Glenn. All in favor? Agenda is adopted. And next you'll see a copy of the minutes from our previous authority meeting held in April. Got a chance to review those, I hope. Could I have a motion to accept those minutes as presented? Moved by John Corot, seconded by Bill King. All in favor of adopting the minutes? Motion is carried. There is no business arising from the minutes, so we will move on to item number 3, which is section 34 amendment of section 34 amendment, and we have Laura Cummings who's going to make a presentation with regard to that. Pardon me. There's a lot of paper sitting on my desk. Laura is the project manager for the Mississippi River Source Protection Region. Laura, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Please let me know if you have any trouble hearing me.
I can hear you.
I don't have a presentation to share. This will be fairly quick, so I won't share my screen or anything. I will very briefly introduce myself since this is the first time I'm meeting with you all. My name is Laura, and I've been with RBCA now for about 2.5 years, and I will be covering for Marika until next July when she returns from maternity leave. So let's get started. The purpose of this report is to obtain approval from the Source Protection Authority to move forward with submission of the Section 34 amendment. In November 2020, a Section 34 amendment was initiated to address a new well in North Grenville. Since then, technical work done by consultants that was needed to revise the assessment report and the source protection plan has been completed and peer reviewed. 2 consultation periods have also been completed. The amendment includes revised wellhead protection area mapping for North Grenville and the village of Merrickville-Wolford. The revised wellhead protection areas resulted in the removal of 7 total potential dense non-aqueous phase liquid threats, 5 in Kentville and 2 in Merrickville. The revised Kentville wellhead protection area resulted in the addition of 2 new potential DNAPL threats, and those property owners have already been contacted by our risk management staff. We pre-consulted with implementing bodies and municipalities affected by the amendment in May and June, and we started public consultation in early July, and that ran to about mid-August. During the pre-consultation period, we only received general reminders from MECP and an inquiry from MTO. There were no comments based on the technical information shared, so no changes were required before moving forward with the public consultation. During the public consultation period, which ran from July 7th to August 13th, we received 1 general inquiry from a member of the public, and that comment is summarized on the last page, I believe, of your Source Protection Authority agenda package. No action was required based on the comments received either for the public consultation, so changes to the final document weren't necessary. Source Protection staff received endorsement from the Source Protection Committee last Tuesday, and once we receive approval from both Source Protection authorities, we will proceed with the submission of the amendment to MECP at the end of the month. And the recommendation is that the Mississippi Valley Source Protection Authority receive this update and direct Source Protection staff to submit the Section 34 amendment.
Thank you, Laura. So our work today is really administrative. The work's been done behind the amendment. There's been public consultations. Folks have had their say. The Source Authority has also reviewed the matter. So we're moving it on. We're really just putting a stamp on this to move it on to submit it to the ministry for approval. And that's our work today. So I've got a motion in front of me. Resolved that the Mississippi Valley Source Protection Authority receive report SPA 78/21 and direct source protection staff to submit the Section 34 amendment to the Ministry of Environment, Conservation and Parks. Could I have a mover for that motion? Moved by Faye Campbell, seconded by Chuck Rigoff. Is there any discussion on the motion? People want to get out of here. Okay, all in favor of the motion, please raise your hands. None opposed. The motion is carried. There is no other business. Could I have a motion to adjourn the Source Protection Authority meeting, please? Moved by Krista Lowry, seconded by Bill King. Bill's getting his name on everything today. All in favor of adjourning the meeting? Meeting is adjourned. Thank you, folks, for making the time to join us at the meeting today. We'll see you all next month. And Eli, you've got lots of time to get off to your next meeting.
Have a good one, everyone.
Okay.
All right,
Bye-bye,
take care,
everyone.
everyone. Thank you.